We are looking at this wonderful love story in Ruth. I'm glad there's a love story in the Bible. Now, we talked back a long time ago about the love between Rachel and Jacob, and it was a pretty good love story. And he loved her even long after she died, which is unusual. But actually, they were both pretty independent people. Rachel especially had her own agenda. This is a love story of a different stripe. And it comes during the time of the judges. You know, that was a time when every man did what was right in his own eyes. The stories in the judges are terrible. One of the best of the judges, Gideon, had many wives and had 70 sons. Or another of the judges was Samson, who kept having these affairs with pagan women. To have a love story set in that time that's the beautiful love that God gives between a man and a woman is just like a ray of light in a dark prison. But not only is it a wonderful love story, it is a beautiful picture of what true salvation means. Now, I put a little picture on your thing, on your sheet. Look at that and tell me what you see. It's on your sheet. This is one of those interesting things that it depends on how you look at it. The young woman is if you're looking back over her and you see her high cheekbone and her jaw right there and her little eyelash, and she's looking that way and has on some kind of fancy hat and maybe a fur coat. The old woman, this is her chin, this is her nose. She's looking down. She has bangs and there's something on her head. Do you see the old woman? Sometimes it's hard to shift back and forth. Well, one picture, two completely different things. Did the old woman scare you? She scared me because I had a teacher in 6th grade that looked like that. And she was mean. Well, there's nothing scary about the picture we see, but we're going to be looking at two different things. In chapter 1, we saw Ruth's beautiful decision. When her husband had died, she left with her mother-in-law to go with her back to the land of Israel. We talked about how they left because there was a famine. They shouldn't have left. Famine was God's judgment against sin. They should have led a revival. But they left. The father died soon after they left. The sons married, then they both died, and 3 widows are left. The most difficult position for any woman in that time was to be a widow without a male family member to take care of them. But Ruth made this decision to go with her mother-in-law, live with her mother-in-law, which is sometimes a challenging relationship, sometimes a beautiful relationship. Challenging maybe even in the best of times. And the other widow decided to go back home to her mother. And we saw that those decisions that Ruth made were a beautiful picture of salvation. When she said, "Where you go, I will go," she was changing the whole direction of her life. When she said, "Where you live, I will live," that meant living in poverty. When she said, "Your people will be my people," she was leaving her family relations, her cultural religion, her religious traditions. She said, "This decision that I'm making is till I die. Mother-in-law, where you die, I'm going to die, and it's going to last beyond death. Where you're buried, I'm going to be buried." And that's a beautiful picture of what it means to turn to Christ. Being a Christian is not just knowing some things in this book or even agreeing with some things in this book. It's my life in Christ's hands. So let's look at chapter 2, and now we start the love story part. Chapter 2, verse 1 says, Naomi had a relative, and the word in the Hebrew is generic. It can be any relative. She had a relative of her husband, so this would be an in-law. And he is a mighty man of wealth, And he is of the family of Elimelech, her husband, and the man's name was Boaz. Now, just like the first chapter, a narrator sets the scene for what's about to happen in this chapter. So he's given us the backstory here. Now, this is a relative that did not leave during the famine, and he did not starve. In fact, after the famine, how is he described? Well off, wealthy. He had many fields, mighty, an adjective used of God many times in the Old Testament. Usually applies to someone who's a warrior. They're real strong, like a knight or something. And the name Boaz means strength. So he is a remarkable character to meet where they have been in the famine. Now, the narrator is holding back on some key information, but we will find that out by the end of the chapter. Now, does anybody remember how long a time period was covered in that first chapter of Ruth? I know it's been 2 weeks. Yes, we know, 10 years. Bible tells us they dwelt in Moab for 10 years. The time frame covered in this chapter is 24 hours. So you see, we're getting down to the nuts and bolts. Look at verse 2. And Ruth the Moabitess, ooh, what a name to call Ruth. Is the writer calling her a bad name? Being a Moabitess, they were enemies of Israel. They were pagan people. He's just telling it like it is. Ruth the Moabitess said to her mother-in-law, I will go out to the fields and glean. Ears of corn is not exactly the translation, but that's how King James translators did it. It means any grain, like wheat has a grain on the end, barley has a grain on the end. I'm going to glean in fields in whose sight I find grace. Now, as we go through this, you're going to hear different characteristics of both Ruth and Boaz. If you would like to write them on your sheet, that's what that is there for. So I see initiative with Ruth. That was something God provided. When they harvested by hand, they left probably 30% of the crop in the fields. And so the poor people were allowed to go pick that up so they could have something to eat. And not just grain, same thing with olives and grapes. So poor people had an opportunity to have food. It was not an expensive burden on the government. They were required to do some level of work to get the food. And I guess it helped the farmers not to be so greedy, to see people picking up some of their crop, and help them to have an opportunity to minister to others. What a wonderful idea God had here. So she says she's going to go glean, in whoever's sight she will find grace. That means favor. In the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it's charis, that word we know from the New Testament. So verse 3, she came and went, and she was gleaning in a field after some reapers. Now, in Bible days, the fields belonging to different people had no fences or hedgerows or even wonderful stone walls like we see from days of old around here. They were marked with a flat stone at one end of the boundary and another flat stone at the corresponding end. And the fields were just all together. If we imagine that those abutments on the back wall came all the way to the front, that's how the fields would be marked. So if you're standing in a field, unless you know the markers, you don't know whose field you're in. And it's easy to move from one person's field to another because of this. So she goes out there. She doesn't know any farmers, and she doesn't know where she's going, but she's going. Look what the Bible says. Her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging to Boaz, who's the relative. who was the kin of her father-in-law. Was that just a hap? No, from our perspective, things look like chance or like accidents even. But from God's perspective, He is moving things according to His plan. I think I've told you many times about the happenstance by which I met my husband when I was engaged to someone else and thought, I'm going to reconsider. It was just a happenstance. I didn't have a ride home from college. Oh, an old boyfriend just happened by. He said, sure, I'll take you. It happened. Stopped at that gas station, and the rest is history. And I look back on that, and I think what a tiny thing that event turned. Now, this was a guy who was in my college, but there were a lot of people in the college. And he was a senior, and I was a lowly freshman. Our paths would not have crossed had I not finagled to get them to cross. It wasn't happenstance, though. God was stopping me from a marriage that my parents were praying wouldn't happen. I didn't know that till many years later. Well, she goes out into the field. She doesn't know who Boaz is. No marker in a field, no sign, this is Boaz's field. He will let gleaners come, Hap. What a strange thing. Well, verse 4, Boaz comes out from Bethlehem because everybody's fields were adjoining outside of a city that would be walled for protection. Nobody lived on their farm like we do. They would be outside, and they would know where their markers were. And the Bible tells us that Boaz came out, and he's talking to his reapers in the fields. And he says to them, the Lord be with you. And they answer, the Lord bless thee. Well, that sounds like an odd work relationship, doesn't it? How many businessmen go out to their employees and say, the Lord be with you today? How many employees answer back, the Lord bless you? This tells you something about Boaz. Not only is he wealthy and mighty and strong, he has a good relationship with the people that work for him. And so that could entail many qualities. I just look at this verse and I think, this man is a godly man. I see what he says. I see how people respond to him. One writer said, if you want to know if a man has a relationship with God, find out how far God has saturated the details of his everyday life. It's not what you do on Sunday. It's what you are the rest of the time. And then verse 5, Boaz immediately said to his servant that was set over all the reapers, who is she? This poor disliked foreigner who by hap came to his field, who by hap landed in the field of the most eligible bachelor in Bethlehem, even though he was older than her. And look at verse 6. The servant said over the reapers, said, oh, it's the Moabitess damsel. She doesn't have a name. She's just a Moabite. That came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab. And she said to me, verse 7, I pray you, let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and has continued from the morning until now, except that she tarried a little in the house. But Boaz has heard about this lady. What does it tell you about Ruth? That she came and asked permission to do what the law permitted on someone else's property. She wasn't an in-your-face girl, was she? She was respectful, not pushy, not presumptuous. Ecclesiastes 10 tells us the words of the mouth of the wise are gracious. If we had a recording of our words yesterday, would they be gracious? My words are usually gracious. Sometimes when I'm in the car, they're not. Well, verse 8, Boaz goes over to Ruth, and here we have their first conversation. He says to her a strange thing in the King James, "Hearest thou not?" He wasn't checking her hearing. It's a Hebrew phrase that kind of means listen carefully. And he addresses her, calling her my daughter, which indicates there is an age difference. Maybe he is old enough to be her father or even her grandfather if he was related to her father-in-law. Although people had children over a wide span, so it doesn't necessarily mean a lot older. Well, this is what he says. "Listen carefully, my daughter. Don't go to glean in another field. Don't go from here, but stay here fast by my maidens." The maidens were the female servants who would get the grain that the reapers had cut, gather it into a bundle, and tie it with a rope. We think of we see kind of sheaves of corn in the fall this way in a field, and that's what they would do. The word that he called them indicates youthful, old enough to marry, but at the present not married. So for this time, that could have been anywhere from about 13 up. I'm glad that Boaz found some friends for Ruth. He was thinking about her emotions and her comfort. Oh, that makes him a good man. And he says, "You stay with my maidens." Now, they knew where the boundaries were. They were his servants. So they could keep Ruth from wandering out of his field. And then in verse 9, he says, "Let your eyes be on the field that they're working in, and go after them, and I have charged the young men that they shall not touch thee." The Hebrew word indicates molest. Now we're in the time of the judges, when every man did what was right in his own eyes. So don't you think that happened in some fields? Yeah. He protected her. That's a wonderful thing for a husband, to be a protector of his wife. And then he says, if you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what they have drawn. Owners did not provide food or water for gleaners. They made some provision sometimes for their workers. And he said, you can have some of their water. Now, at this time, we have no indication of romantic attraction between Boaz and Ruth, although I think something's starting, at least in his heart. And we don't know from Scripture if Ruth was attractive or not attractive. But if I had been out working in the fields, if I looked good when I went, it would not take long. I hope you never see me coming in from the yard. You will be horrified. It's interesting to me that in this passage, the writer is only speaking of Ruth's internal characteristics. She's taking care of her mother-in-law. She's a hard worker. She's polite. Says nothing about her outer characteristics. I hope someday we're going to have a Bible study from 1 Peter 3, where we are told that the ornament we should wear to adorn ourselves is a meek and quiet spirit, which I think Ruth personifies here. Don't be horrified by that. We'll understand it when we get to Peter. Well, verse 10, this seems strange to us, but it tells you what Ruth's expectations for treatments from people in Bethlehem were. She fell on her face and bowed herself to the ground. Now that's very respectful. It also has a nuance of bowing in not just submission, but almost reverence. or something. And she asked Boaz a question. Why have I found grace in your eyes that you should take knowledge of me, seeing that I'm a stranger or a foreigner or an immigrant? You know what amazes me about Ruth? We never hear Ruth saying, why have all the bad things happened to me? She could say, why did my husband die? Why do I have to live with my mother-in-law who has nothing? Why do we have to be hungry? She could have. But I just see at this point, spiritually speaking, quite a difference in Naomi's attitude. Oh, everything's been bad. And Ruth's, why have I found favor? Again, the humble and the quiet and the meek spirit. And Boaz answers her. Look at verse 11. Boaz said to her, it's been fully showed me all that you have done unto your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you left your father and your mother, and the land of your birth, and art come to a people which thou knowest not before. Actually, this is astounding allegiance from Ruth to her mother-in-law. Because in this Bible times, as well as like in India today, when you marry, you become the servant of your mother-in-law. But there's a lot of conflicts in there. Our friends from India, I've heard many harrowing tales about murders of mother-in-laws or of daughter-in-laws when the relationship was not good. Well, she's trusting God. She's low in her own eyes, and Boaz knows it. How did Boaz know it? He heard it because when they came back to town, that was the buzz on the town, that Naomi was back, that her status had changed, that her pagan daughter-in-law was back with her, and everybody talked about it. How many of you have ever lived in a small town? You know how quick. You can almost hear the buzz in the grocery on the street when there's news. But look at verse 12. This is very precious. Boaz says to her, the Lord recompense thy work, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust. Now there's some big things here, and I don't want us to miss them. First of all, the Lord recompense your work, and a full reward be given you by God. Does that mean that we earn the favor of God by the good things we have done? Well, now some of you are shaking your head no. Is that your opinion? Or do you have a Bible verse that substantiates that?
Well, the rest of this one kind of substantiates it.
The rest of it does. You're correct. But I will tell you, many people, even in Christian churches, they believe that God has saved them, and they believe that they are sinners. But they believe that God had a good idea when he saved them because they weren't that bad. And they came to church every week, and they taught at church, and they gave money to church. And it's like we're in the scales, and we're going to pump up our good works. No, that is not right, and I'm glad that you could see that. But let me ask you this. Does the Lord recompense you when you do the right thing? He does. He does. Maybe not right away. Maybe not a feeling. I know the years I lived with a mother-in-law, it was hard for me to have the feeling of being recompensed. I rather had the feeling of being imposed on. this was in my mind. Some of those years I was not a believer, so I'm not surprised that was in my mind. I look back on it and I'm very glad. And James more than once said to me, I have never seen my mother as happy as she is in our home, because she had a horrible marriage. She had a horrible life. God does recompense us, but not with money. Sometimes with just that feeling you have when you know you've done the right thing, and you know what kind of feeling you would have if you did the wrong thing. You would have the guilt and then the consequences from that. So he does recompense us. But the beautiful thing about Ruth is that she has come to rest and to trust under God's wing. I love this picture. I'm not a country girl and I've never seen this in real life, but I would love to see a mother getting a little chick under her wings. I bet last night, if there were any chicks yet, some mothers got them under their wings during the storm that we had last night. That is a very precious thing. And this, Janice, is correct. This is why God is going to bless Ruth, because she has turned to him for her protection. She is not looking at anything she does, however magnanimous, to merit God's protection. You know, as I studied, I thought how this was so different of the Pharisees. They looked at Jesus, and Jesus invited them to come to him and rest. But they did not want to be under the wings of Jesus. They justified themselves. They relied on their good works. And they glorified themselves. They had no interest in being under Jesus' wings because they were trusting. They had tipped that scale in their favor by their works. I love the verse that I put on your sheet. This is one of the places in the Bible where God speaks of this same metaphor, where the psalmist said, "Be merciful, O God, be merciful to thee, for in thee my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of your wings I take refuge." God showed mercy to Ruth not because she took care of her mother-in-law, but because she took refuge under the wings of God. I don't know if you know that spot or not, but I will just say there's no spot like that spot. Well, verse 13, Ruth says, "Let me find favor in your sight, my Lord." She's respectful to him. "For you have comforted me." Now that's another trait of Boaz. He comforts her. "And for that you have spoken friendly unto thy handmaid." That is a strange translation. Literally in the Hebrew it means you have spoken to my heart. Though I am not like the rest of the people here. And verse 14, Boaz said to her, "At mealtime, come up here and eat of the bread and dip thy morsel in the vinegar." And she sat beside the reapers, and he served her parched corn, and she did eat and was sufficed. She was satisfied. And she left off eating before she had eaten all he gave. Now, this is the first hint of romance that I see. It was a private invitation to her. He's already told these guys, she gets no flack from you. At mealtime, he invited her not only to share fully in the meal, he serves her. He hands food to her. Even the privileged dipping the morsel in the dip, in the vinegar. You remember at the Last Supper, who did Jesus dip it and give it to? Judas. And that was a sign of the honored guest, whoever got that. And Boaz does that the first day he sees her. And what blessed my heart, it said Ruth ate and she was satisfied. How long do you think it had been since she had eaten enough that she felt satisfied? Well, she kept some back. She's going to take that to her mother-in-law. Oh, that's another good thing about Ruth. When she was satisfied, she quit eating, which is a wonderful thing for all of us, and not a thing I always succeed at doing. Well, she got up from lunch, verse 15, to glean, and then Boaz talks to the reapers again. She says, let her glean even among the sheaves, where they have set up sheaves of the grain. Now, normally reapers would be working and the gleaners would be away from them, and they could only come up where the reapers had been after they got through there. And Boaz says, let her go among the sheaves and do not reproach her. Nothing to this woman about being a Moabite. No innuendo. I expect all of us have been in a workplace or a public place where men said inappropriate things, and you just get tired of it. But Boaz said, no, none of that. Again, he's protecting her. And then verse 16, he tells these guys, just drop some handfuls of grain on purpose for her and leave them that she may get them. And don't rebuke her. Isn't that sweet? That's like an Easter egg hunt where you hide some real sympathy for the little ones, that they can find. Handfuls on purpose. Boaz is not only generous, he is generous way over and beyond what the law requires. Verse 17, so she gleaned in the field until sunset and beat out what she had gleaned. They had to beat the stalks of what they had gleaned with something, or sometimes they put them on a floor and let oxen pull a board over them, and that separated the grain from the chaff, and they can get out the good part. And it was about an ephah of barley. Do some of your translations have a modern amount in verse 17? We don't do ephahs. My Bible said 1.1 bushels. So you've seen a bushel of something, apples, peaches, corn. Oh, that's a job. So she threshed it out and separated it, and she had that much. Now, another place in Scripture, it says, some other translations says she had 10 omars. And when God gave his children manna in the wilderness, it said every man got 1 omar, and that was how much every man could eat in a day. So if she had 10 omars of grain, she had enough for 10 days for one person, or 5 days for the two of them, which is more than they've had since before they left Bethlehem before. And verse 18 says, she took it up and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and she brought forth and gave to her what she had taken in her take-home from the lunch that they had after she was full. Now that tells me something else about Ruth. She loved her mother-in-law, that she saved some for her, and was obviously glad to take this all to her and not keep back anything for herself. And I love verse 19. Naomi says, where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be whoever the owner was that he took notice of you. And she showed her mother-in-law with whom she had wrought, and she said, the man's name with whom I wrought today is Boaz. Actually, most writers on this passage said she got about 5 times more than a normal gleaner would get in a day. So it was remarkable. And she knows that the man's name is Boaz. I don't know that she knows anything else about him. She never met her husband's family back home. Well, Naomi said to her in verse 20, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left his kindness to the living and to the dead." Naomi's view of the sovereignty of God has changed from chapter 1, where she said, "God's been so bitter to me. This is bitter stuff, hard stuff that I've had to deal with." And then Naomi drops the bombshell. She says, "This man is near of kin unto us, one of our next kinsmen." Now this is a different word than was used in verse 1 when he was introduced as some relative. This is that wonderful word in the Bible that means the one who can be a kinsman redeemer. That would be a husband, one of the husband's near relatives, who, if people got so poor they sold themselves into slavery, that person could buy them back. Now, this family had left Bethlehem for 10 years. The law was if you left your inheritance for 3 years, first person with some money could put that in his name. So they have lost whatever field they had or whatever dwelling they had, but the near kinsman can buy that back if he's willing. That's what Naomi was thinking about. The Lord's kindness has not forsaken the living, you and me, or the dead, my husband, your husband. Now, God has done a lot for Naomi. He's stopped the famine. He's bound Ruth to her in love. He's preserved Boaz for Ruth. Why did the girls in Bethlehem let a man of character go? Maybe they didn't care for that. God just did it. But I'm glad that Naomi is seeing God's light and love to her, that he is good to all who take refuge under his wings. The kinsman redeemer could deliver somebody back to what they were before they had all the losses. And if he was unmarried, he could marry a widow to raise up children with his brother's name who would own the inheritance of the brother. This is very significant. In this way, Boaz is kind of a picture of what Christ did for us. Actually, when he met us, we were slaves. We were slaves to a cruel master. And he bought us. He purchased us. You know, there's an Old Testament word that's never used in the New Testament, and it's atone. The sacrifices atoned for sin. Atone means covered. They covered their sins. So at that, they could have fellowship with God. Their sins were covered. But redeemed means to purchase and to move and to buy back. And it's a different thing than just having your sin, coming to church and getting forgiven or whatever they thought it was. Well, verse 21, Ruth says, he said to me also, "Thou shalt keep fast by my young men until they have ended all the harvest." Wait a minute, is that what Boaz said? Come on, your short-term memory's still in. No, earlier in the chapter, he told her to stay close to his maidens. I can't explain that. I noticed that a lot of Bible translations just say, "keep close to my servants." But actually, it is the same word as young men that was earlier in the chapter. Maybe he meant keep close to them at lunchtime. And I want you to stay until the end of harvest, and which would be 6 weeks. Naomi said unto Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his maidens, and that nobody sees you in anybody else's field." That's interesting to me. After all Boaz has done for you, would you go to somebody else's field where it's not safe and you're not valued and your heart's not spoken to? But you know, sometimes I think of all the things God has blessed me with, and sometimes I just wander out into the fields of the world and think I'm going to find some satisfaction there. Oh, I'm tired. Let me sit down and just watch television. Any blessing there? Oh, I'm tired. I need a large piece of cake. Any real satisfaction there? No, I'm tired. I'm not going to fool with you. I'm going to take care of what I need to do. So, verse 23, which is like the summary of this chapter, she kept close to the maidens, yay, of Boaz to glean until the end of the barley harvest and of the wheat harvest, and dwelt with her mother-in-law. Well, I see her diligence again. That in those two harvests together would be 3 months. So that's a lot of food. If she got enough for 10. It reminded me of the passage in Proverbs about go to the ant. They don't have any ruler or overseer, and yet they get all of their food for the winter. She is a diligent person. Ants are wonderful. There's a little ant in South America that's 1/4 of an inch high, and they build a mud home that's 20 feet high. But they really have it filled with food, and they carry many times their weight on their back to bring it in. And if you've ever watched ants, they stay busy. They make their trail. They're not deterred. If you disturb their trail, they make another one. I was interested to read that in Jewish tradition, there was a length of time before a woman could join the Jewish religion, and it was 3 months. And after 3 months, she could join the Jewish religion and she could marry in the Jewish tradition. So I think it's interesting that we've got 3 months. The stage is set. But there's a villain that will, not a villain, but a problem that we'll talk about next time. I appreciate your presence. We will meet next February 9th. That sounds so far away. And I hope that we will finish the story because I'm so excited. I want to see them married.